Las Vegas, early 1970s. The International Hotel blazes like a cathedral of neon, its lights cutting the desert night. Inside, thousands wait. Elegant women clutching flowers, men in tailored suits swirling whiskey in crystal glasses, reporters sharpening their pens for scandal. The air hums with something more than excitement. It feels like ritual, as if the room itself has been consecrated for one man. Then the orchestra strikes, the curtain lifts, and Elvis Presley steps into the light. The crowd erupts, voices crashing like a tidal wave. For a moment, it seems untouchable, eternal. Music, devotion, and spectacle fused into one. But not everyone has come to worship. In the second row, a shadow stirs. A hand tightens beneath a chair. And in the middle of "Love Me Tender," when silence has settled like glass, the unthinkable happens. A bottle arcs through the air and shatters at Elvis's feet. The room gasps. Fans scream. Security lunges. A career, a legend, a man, suspended in one heartbeat of danger. What Elvis does next will shock the world, silence his enemies, and turn an act of violence into one of the most unforgettable nights in music history. Let us know where you're watching from, and we hope you enjoy the story. Las Vegas in the early 70s was a city that never allowed silence. Even at midnight, the Strip pulsed with neon arteries, casinos flickering in gaudy reds and electric blues, the constant chime of slot machines spilling from every doorway, and the hum of limousines crawling bumper to bumper down Paradise Road. Tourists flooded sidewalks in silk shirts and sequined dresses, eager for the night's entertainment. For many, the ultimate prize wasn't the cards or the dice. It was the chance to see Elvis Presley live at the International Hotel. By 1970, Elvis had returned from years of formulaic Hollywood movies and a near retreat from the stage. His televised '68 comeback special had reignited not only his career, but something deeper in the American psyche. Now, in Vegas, he was no longer the shy Southern boy in a pink jacket from the '50s. He had become a larger-than-life figure, dressed in rhinestone-studded jumpsuits that caught every beam of light like exploding stars. To his fans, the performances felt less like concerts and more like pilgrimages, ritual gatherings where ordinary people were pulled into the orbit of something nearly mythic. Inside the main showroom of the International, the air was heavy with anticipation. Waiters balanced silver trays loaded with cocktails, weaving between tightly packed tables draped in white cloth. The stage itself stretched wider than most theaters, its curtains drawn tight, hiding the promise behind them. Spotlights rested like watchful eyes above the crowd. For the women who filled the front rows, faces flushed from champagne and excitement, the evening felt like an electric storm was about to break. Many had come back night after night, knowing they would never tire of the moment the king stepped onto that stage. Yet not every face reflected devotion. Sprinkled among the rows were men who leaned back in their chairs, arms crossed, eyes cool and cynical. Some were journalists from New York or Los Angeles, dispatched to Vegas not to celebrate, but to dissect. Others were critics who sneered that Elvis's shows weren't rock and roll at all, but circus acts for housewives and middle-aged tourists. Their notebooks lay open, ready to capture the slightest stumble. A rumor had already circulated in industry circles. Elvis is finished. He can't last in Vegas. It's a parody now. Even more unsettling were those who came not as observers, but as hecklers, men who carried with them the bitterness of failed lives, disguising it as contempt for celebrity. On this particular evening, near the front, sat a cluster of such men. They weren't dressed like the tuxedoed gamblers around them. Their shirts were wrinkled, ties loosened, hair slicked back carelessly. They had the restless look of outsiders, people who didn't belong to the world of velvet booths and $5 cocktails, but had pushed their way inside anyway. The contrast in the room was jarring. To the left of the stage, a group of women clutched at each other's hands, whispering in anticipation, their bracelets jingling as they leaned forward. Just a few tables away, one of the hostile men smirked, tapping his cigarette against the ashtray in short, impatient bursts. Each exhale of smoke rose like a challenge, curling into the golden light above. The room seemed to exist in two parallel realities, one vibrating with worship, the other thick with disdain. Elvis himself, behind the curtain, was fully aware of this tension. He had performed enough nights in Vegas to know the crowd was never homogeneous. His smile, once purely effortless, had become something more controlled, part shield and part weapon. The weight of expectation pressed heavily on him. His manager, Colonel Parker, demanded sellout seasons. The critics demanded he prove he was more than a nostalgia act. The fans demanded the impossible, that he remain forever young, forever magnetic, forever their Elvis. He adjusted the collar of his white jumpsuit, embroidered with a golden eagle stretching its wings across his chest. The costume shimmered under the backstage bulbs, each rhinestone catching fire when the light hit it. The jumpsuit was no accident. It was armor. In Las Vegas, where spectacle ruled, Elvis knew the suit had to shine brighter than the casino chandeliers, to stand taller than the desert itself. But armor could only do so much. Beneath the glitter, he carried the quiet knowledge that danger lurked in every crowd. The international showroom didn't search every guest. Security was present, but thin, too thin for a man who had grown up poor in Tupelo, who still carried the instincts of someone who had known fear up close. He had seen brawls erupt in his early days, playing Southern honky-tonks. He had dodged flying bottles before. And though Vegas crowds came dressed in silk, they were no less unpredictable. From backstage, he could hear the rising clamor of the audience. The low rumble of conversation had built into a chant. "Elvis! Elvis! Elvis!" It was a wall of sound, both exhilarating and suffocating. He took a deep breath, rolling his shoulders back. He was about to step into the storm again. Out front, one of the men in the hostile group leaned forward, eyes fixed not on the stage, but on something hidden beneath his chair. His hand hovered near it, restless, while his companions exchanged quiet, conspiratorial grins. No one else noticed. The fans were too enraptured, the waiters too busy, the journalists too preoccupied with their notepads. But a thin wire of tension ran from that corner of the room straight to the stage, unseen but palpable. When the house lights dimmed, the air seemed to collapse in on itself. A sharp scream from a woman in the balcony pierced through, and then the orchestra launched into the pounding opening of Also Sprach Zarathustra, the theme he had adopted to announce his arrival. The drums rolled like distant thunder. The horns blared like the trumpets of some biblical army. The entire room rose to its feet as the curtain drew back. Elvis emerged in a blaze of light. His cape, lined with red satin, caught the air as he strode forward, every step measured, regal yet urgent. The roar of the crowd became physical, a tidal wave of sound that shook glasses on tables and rattled chandeliers. Women reached out desperately toward the stage, eyes wet, mouths open in cries that seemed torn from their souls. But amid this sea of devotion, those hostile eyes remained fixed, cold, and sharp. And though Elvis smiled, bowing low before the orchestra swung into the first chords of C.C. Rider, he felt them like daggers against his skin. He knew tonight would not be like any other. The first notes of C.C. Rider cracked through the air like lightning, and the room erupted. The brass section hit with thunderous force, drums pounding as if the walls themselves were trembling under the rhythm. Elvis moved to the center of the stage, microphone in hand, his stance wide and commanding. The white jumpsuit with its eagle wings seemed to shimmer with each motion, a halo of sequins reflecting the floodlights above. For the fans, it was as though the man before them wasn't flesh and blood, but some celestial force stepping down to meet mortals. Women in the front rows clasped their hands to their faces, tears streaking carefully applied makeup. Men, who might have resisted at first, soon found themselves swaying unconsciously, pulled into the gravity of the music. Security guards positioned at the lip of the stage stood stiff, scanning the rows, but even their hardened expressions betrayed hints of awe. Elvis worked the crowd like a conductor, feeding on their energy. He threw in playful grins between lyrics, tossing scarves to outstretched hands. His hips moved with that unmistakable rhythm that had once scandalized television censors, but now felt like pure ritual to his devotees. Every flick of his wrist, every tilt of his head, sent ripples of hysteria across the audience. But in the second row, just left of center, a figure sat unmoved. A man in his 30s, his jaw clenched, his face set in a hard mask. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, eyes fixed on Elvis, not with admiration, but with something darker, resentment, perhaps even hostility. Unlike those around him, he did not rise when others leapt to their feet. He did not clap. He did not sing along. He seemed to wait, simmering. What caught the eye of one of the nearby guards was not the man's stillness, but the way his right hand lingered under his chair. Hidden in the shadows, his fingers seemed to toy with something unseen. The guard's brows furrowed. He shifted, trying to get a better angle, but the crowd's frenzy made it nearly impossible. With fans surging forward and arms waving, discerning one suspicious movement in a sea of hundreds felt like trying to catch a whisper in a storm. The guard stayed alert, but didn't yet move. On stage, Elvis continued, driving the song with raw force. His voice, gravelly, rich, unrestrained, rolled over the room like a wave. Between verses, he leaned into the microphone with a mischievous smirk. "Vegas, you ready to have a good time tonight?" The audience screamed in reply, nearly drowning out the orchestra's swell. He laughed, that deep, throaty laugh that felt both intimate and larger than life, and launched into another verse. His eyes swept across the hall, connecting with faces one by one. To most, it felt like he had seen them personally, a look that said, "You matter. You're part of this." But when his gaze passed over that second-row figure, the sensation shifted. Even from the stage, Elvis could sense it. The coldness, the refusal to be touched by the moment. It wasn't new. He had seen it before. There were always a few who came not to join, but to challenge. Still, something about the set of that man's shoulders, the way his companions whispered and laughed too loudly at odd times, gave Elvis a chill beneath the heat of the lights. The song ended in a roar of applause. Fans rose, clapping wildly, whistling, shouting his name. Elvis bowed slightly, sweat already shining along his temples. He reached for a towel, dabbed his face, and gave a playful shrug. "Lord have mercy," he said, catching his breath. "Y'all gonna wear me out before we get started." The laughter rolled over the room, easing some of the intensity. He tossed the towel into the sea of hands, and a small tug-of-war broke out among ecstatic women who screamed as though it were a holy relic. He moved smoothly into the next number, this time a medley of older hits. The room was alive with nostalgia. Couples clutched each other, reliving youth. For Elvis, these moments carried a strange duality. The crowd gave him life, but he was never entirely free of the weight pressing in from the edges, the expectation, the scrutiny. Every critic in the room sharpened their pens when he sang a note slightly flat. Every rival measured his sweat-soaked exertion as proof he was faltering. And still, the hostile figure in the front refused to move. When others swayed, he stayed rigid. When the crowd roared, he remained silent. His left hand tapped a slow, deliberate beat on the table, not in time with the music, but with something else, private and unnerving. Beneath the table, his right hand lingered, clutching whatever lay hidden. The guard who had noticed earlier leaned forward, signaling discreetly to another. They exchanged a look, but did not act. The international security team had been trained to stay invisible unless absolutely necessary. Colonel Parker despised distractions that might break the illusion of perfection. For now, they watched. Elvis shifted gears, slowing the pace. "We're going to change it up a little," he said, flashing that grin again. The band softened, and he crooned into, "I just can't help believin'." The hall seemed to sway with him, hundreds of hearts caught in the rhythm of tenderness. The tension melted for most, eyes closed, hands clasped, couples leaning into each other. But in that one corner, the air thickened. From the stage, Elvis could feel it, two realities colliding under one roof. 1,000 people surrendered themselves to music, while a single man simmered in defiance, pulling the energy in another direction. He knew enough from years of performing in rowdy southern bars to recognize it, the spark of trouble waiting to ignite. Yet Elvis did what he had always done. He smiled through it, feeding the crowd more of himself, hoping his light would eclipse whatever darkness lurked in that corner. Still, somewhere in the back of his mind, he wondered, how long before something breaks? The show had rolled forward like a river in flood, unrelenting, luminous, unstoppable. By the time the first half-hour passed, sweat ran down Elvis's temples, catching in the sequins of his suit, until he looked as if light itself poured from his skin. His energy was inexhaustible, his voice a storm that carried both force and tenderness. He had given the crowd fire with Polk Salad Annie, then laughter with playful banter, and now he slowed the current with something quieter, something intimate. The orchestra eased into the opening chords of "Love Me Tender." A hush descended, like the air in a chapel just before prayer. The chaos of clinking glasses, the whispers, the scribbling of journalists' pens, all faded. Couples leaned into each other, hands entwined on tabletops. A few in the balcony wiped their eyes before the first lyric even left his mouth. Elvis stepped closer to the edge of the stage, lowering his voice into that velvet register that made even a simple line feel like a confession. His eyes searched the front rows, pausing here and there, meeting gaze after gaze. He bent to kiss the cheek of a woman reaching desperately toward him, then straightened, the melody still soft and fragile in his throat. The room swayed with him, every heart caught in that simple rhythm of longing. It was precisely in that moment, when vulnerability hung in the air, that the fracture came. A sudden whistle of air, sharp and fast, cut through the hush. Then, the unmistakable crash of shattering glass. A green beer bottle exploded at the edge of the stage, fragments skittering across the polished wood, catching the lights in jagged reflections. Gasps rippled through the room. A woman in the front row screamed. A man ducked instinctively, arms over his head. The orchestra faltered for half a beat before pulling itself back together. The sound of the impact still rang in the ears of those nearest the stage. Elvis stopped mid-line. For the briefest second, no longer than a breath, he froze. His body stiffened, his eyes locked on the shards glinting near his boots. The microphone hung inches from his lips, silent. The moment stretched unnaturally long, as if the room itself forgot how to breathe. The audience, seconds before swaying in romantic reverie, turned chaotic. Dozens of heads whipped around, searching for the culprit. Fingers pointed, voices rose. It was him! Back there. Throw him out! The fragile cocoon of the song shattered into panic. Security surged forward from the aisles, radios crackling, but they were too slow to stop the shock wave of emotion. Women near the stage began sobbing, terrified that Elvis might have been hurt. Others shouted in anger, standing on chairs, demanding retribution. The critics scribbled furiously, pens scratching like knives across paper. They had their story, sensational and ugly. And yet, in the midst of the frenzy, Elvis did not retreat. Instinct told most men to step back, to let the guards swarm the stage, to demand calm through authority. But Elvis had been raised in rough Southern clubs where chairs were thrown as often as applause. He had survived military service, endured mobs of fans pulling at his clothes, until he bled. Fear was not foreign to him. What set him apart was how he chose to face it. Slowly, deliberately, he bent down. The spotlight followed him as he crouched, his cape folding around his knees like wings. With his bare hand, he picked up one of the larger shards of glass. It caught the light, throwing sharp reflections into the eyes of the first rows. The audience fell silent again, a silence not of romance now, but of suspense so taut it felt like a wire ready to snap. Elvis straightened, holding the fragment up for all to see. His expression was unreadable. Not anger, not fear, but something steadier. The room braced itself. Would he lash out? Would he curse? Would he abandon the show? Instead, he let the corner of his mouth twitch upward in something that resembled a smile. The hush deepened, hundreds of eyes fixed on him, waiting, trembling. They wanted him to speak, to act, to tell them how to feel. At that instant, Elvis Presley, sweat dripping, glass in hand, lights searing down, stood not only as a singer, but as the unchallenged master of the moment. The question wasn't what had just happened. The question was how he would rewrite it. The crowd held its breath. The stage lights glared down on Elvis, his white suit glowing like polished ivory against the black backdrop. In his hand, the shard of glass sparkled with cruel beauty, a jagged star ripped from the bottle that had nearly struck him. For one impossible second, it seemed as though time had stopped. The band frozen with instruments half raised, fans clutching their throats, security pushing forward but uncertain, unwilling to act until their star gave them direction. Then Elvis broke the silence. He tilted his head, studying the shard, as though it were nothing more than an oddly shaped souvenir, and lifted it high above his head so even those in the back rows could see. His lips curved into a sly grin. "Well," he said, voice carrying with perfect clarity across the hushed hall, "if this is your way of buying me a drink, sugar, you missed the bar." For a beat, no one knew whether to laugh. Then, as though a dam had burst, the entire room erupted. Laughter rolled through the theater, nervous at first, then thunderous, mingled with applause. Women wiped tears of shock from their eyes, now laughing with relief. Even a few journalists chuckled despite themselves, their pens momentarily stilled. The tension that had threatened to shatter the night cracked, but instead of breaking, it turned into release. Elvis lowered the shard, balancing it carefully on the edge of his palm before passing it to a stagehand. He looked back at the audience, shaking his head with mock seriousness. "Now, y'all don't have to throw glass. Flowers, scarves, Kisses. Those I can handle. The room howled. Whistles pierced the air. For a few precious moments, it felt as if the incident had dissolved into nothing more than another Vegas anecdote, the kind of story fans would retell with laughter decades later. But then Elvis did something unexpected. He let the grin fade. His eyes softened. His voice dropped low. "You know," he began slowly, "sometimes people walk in here carrying a lot of anger. Maybe it's from outside. Maybe it's from long ago. But tonight," he swept his gaze across the thousands of faces, lingering, deliberate. "Tonight, I don't want hate in this room. I want music. Just music." The transformation was immediate. Where laughter had just echoed, now there was silence again, but not the silence of fear. It was reverence, charged with something greater than entertainment. The words struck deep, bypassing cynicism. Even those who had come only to mock felt it, a weight pressing against their chests, a reminder that they weren't merely watching a man sing, they were witnessing someone turn chaos into communion. From the balcony, a woman's sob carried clearly through the stillness. Someone else shouted, "We love you, Elvis!" Others followed, voices rising like a tide. "Elvis! Elvis!" The chant swelled until it filled the room, not as a demand, but as an offering. Elvis stood there, silent, letting it wash over him. For once, he did not move with the beat or crack another joke. He simply listened. His face betrayed a flicker of something private. Weariness, perhaps, or gratitude that bordered on pain. Then he nodded once, a slow, solemn acknowledgement, before turning back to the band. The musicians, sensing the shift, adjusted instinctively. The conductor gave a subtle nod, and the orchestra flowed back into the melody, this time with a gentler hand. Elvis raised the microphone again, but before singing, he looked once more toward the restless section where the trouble had begun. His eyes found the shadowed figure, the man who had hurled the bottle, now slumped low in his seat, as though trying to disappear beneath the weight of hundreds of accusing stares. For a brief instant, their gazes locked. Elvis didn't scowl. He didn't call him out. Instead, he gave the faintest of smiles, one no one else would notice. Then he turned away, refocusing on the audience as a whole. The music swelled, and Elvis launched back into "Love Me Tender," this time starting from the verse he had been forced to abandon. His voice was steady, but something new threaded through it. Gravity. The tenderness in the song carried a deeper resonance now, as if forgiveness had been woven into every note. The hall hung on each syllable, every vibration of his voice sinking like water into dry soil. By the time he reached the chorus, fans were already on their feet, swaying together. The earlier fear was gone. In its place was something almost sacred. People were not just listening, they were participating, holding on to the fragile unity that one man's choice had created in the face of violence. And when the final note faded, the ovation was deafening. It wasn't just applause for a song, it was gratitude, a release of tension and recognition that they had been spared a darker outcome. Elvis let the ovation run its course, smiling again, this time warmer, genuine. He bowed deeply, his cape spreading across the stage like wings. Then he whispered into the mic, his voice nearly lost beneath the roar but clear enough to those closest to hear. "Thank you. Thank you for letting the music win." The crowd surged to its feet once more, cheering, crying, applauding. Journalists, caught between duty and emotion, scribbled feverishly, knowing they could never quite capture what had just happened. Elvis straightened, sweat glistening, and moved into the next song, but the night had already changed. The incident would linger like smoke in the air. The audience would leave, knowing they had seen something unforgettable. Not just a concert, but a glimpse of a man who refused to let hate dictate the story. And yet, deep inside, Elvis knew this was not the end of the night's test. He could still feel the eyes of that man in the second row, the tension that had not fully dissolved. Something told him the storm was not yet over. The thunder of applause still echoed in the hall when the spotlight shifted slightly, sweeping across the orchestra pit and spilling over the crowd. Security had been moving quietly, slipping between rows, their dark suits blending into the shadows. They had taken note of the direction fingers pointed, the angry whispers of, "It was him. That's the one!" There was no mistaking it now. The man slouched in the second row, his friends shrinking back from him, was the culprit. The suspect looked smaller than he had moments before, as though the light itself pressed down on him. His hair was damp with sweat, his jaw set in a stubborn line, but his eyes flickered nervously toward the exits. His companions had gone quiet, refusing to meet his gaze. What had begun as a display of bravado was dissolving into shame. The audience sensed the shift. Murmurs rose like a restless tide. "Throw him out!" shouted a woman in the third row, her voice sharp as a whip. "Get him out of here!" Others chimed in, pointing, jeering. The same crowd that only minutes earlier had been united in song now thirsted for punishment. Two guards closed in, their shoulders squared, ready to drag the man up by force if necessary. Chairs scraped as those nearby pulled back to give room, eager to see him humiliated. The tension was no longer centered on the stage, but on the drama unfolding in the crowd itself. It was as though the show had shifted from music to judgment. And then Elvis intervened. From the stage, he extended one arm, palm raised, commanding attention without a word. The gesture was so firm, so deliberate, that the guards froze mid-step. The crowd fell into uncertain silence, waiting. Elvis adjusted the microphone stand with his free hand, his expression calm but unwavering. "No," he said simply, his voice carrying clear above the murmurs. "Wait." The guards exchanged looks, but held their ground. The man in the second row blinked, stunned. The audience erupted in protest. "Throw him out! He could have hurt you! We don't want him here!" The cries grew louder, a wave of outrage threatening to drown reason. Elvis let it swell for a moment, then leaned toward the microphone, his tone steady but edged with quiet authority. "He came here angry," Elvis said, his eyes sweeping across the furious crowd. "But maybe he'll leave with a song in his heart." The words struck like a slap, shocking the audience into stillness. For several seconds, there was only silence, punctuated by the faint hum of the amplifiers and the nervous cough of someone in the balcony. The contrast was almost unbearable. Thousands wanted vengeance, yet their idol, whose safety had been jeopardized, was asking for mercy. The man in the second row shifted uneasily, clearly unprepared for such a reprieve. He avoided Elvis's gaze, but the color had drained from his face. His companions leaned away from him as though distance might absolve them of complicity. The crowd's reaction splintered. Some clapped uncertainly, moved by the generosity of the gesture. Others hissed and booed, outraged at the thought of rewarding aggression with leniency. A woman near the stage sobbed openly, torn between gratitude that Elvis was unharmed and disbelief at his decision. Reporters scribbled furiously, recognizing the headlines that would scream across morning papers. Some were already imagining the opening lines. In a shocking turn, Presley halted security and offered mercy to a man who threatened his show. Elvis, meanwhile, remained unshaken. He adjusted the mic again, tapping it lightly, and gave a small smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Listen," he said, his voice softer now, intimate. "We all got battles nobody else sees. Maybe his came out the wrong way tonight. But I'll tell you something. No bottle, no anger, no hate is gonna stop this music." The audience stirred. Murmurs faded into applause, hesitant at first, then swelling into a roar. Not everyone agreed, but Elvis's conviction had a force that pulled them along. Slowly, the room shifted from fury to reluctant admiration. The guards, still uncertain, looked to Elvis one last time. He gave a small nod, dismissing them, and they stepped back into the shadows. The man who had thrown the bottle sat rigid, stunned, as if shackled by a different kind of power. Not force, but forgiveness. Elvis turned to the band. "Let's keep it moving, fellas," he said, his tone brisk, professional, as though nothing had happened. But the atmosphere in the room was electric, charged with the aftershock of what they had just witnessed. He launched into the next number, this time with deliberate intensity. His voice rang stronger than before, every note sharpened by the decision he had just made. He wasn't only performing a song, he was reclaiming the stage from violence, reasserting that the night belonged to music, not to hate. Yet beneath the applause, beneath the swelling chords, one truth lingered. The night was far from over. The audience could not forget the man still seated in the second row, the intruder who had threatened to unravel everything. Their eyes darted toward him between songs, their whispers carrying suspicion, curiosity, contempt. And Elvis, though he smiled, though he sang as if nothing could shake him, felt the undercurrent too. It was as if the show had been set on a knife's edge. One wrong move, one more spark, and the balance could tip again. But for now, he had chosen grace. And grace, in that glittering Vegas showroom, had become the most shocking act of all. The room had begun to settle again, though the air still carried a restless charge. Elvis moved through the next number, his voice unwavering, but every heart in the showroom was tethered to the memory of shattered glass and the startling act of mercy that had followed. Eyes continued to flick nervously toward the second row. The man sat stiff as stone, shoulders drawn, as if the very spotlight of judgment pressed down on him even in darkness. Elvis finished the song, holding the last note longer than usual, his voice filling the cavernous space until silence seemed the only proper response. He let it linger, then lowered the microphone slowly. Instead of moving straight into the next hit, he paused. The crowd waited, uncertain. He glanced back at the band, who held their instruments mid-air, waiting for his cue. Then he spoke. "You know," he said quietly, "a night like this can go 100 different ways. Somebody throws something, tempers flare, folks get angry, but I think maybe we need to take this someplace else, somewhere higher." The crowd leaned forward. Even the critics, pens poised, froze in anticipation. Elvis turned back toward the audience, scanning faces until his eyes found the man in the second row. He didn't point, didn't call him out, but the intention was unmistakable. "I'd like to dedicate the next song," Elvis said, "to the man who's having a rough night. Maybe this will mean something to him. Maybe to all of us." A ripple of shock ran through the crowd. Gasps, whispers, and scattered protests filled the room. Dedicate a song? To him? The same man who had nearly injured Elvis? Security shifted uncomfortably, unsure if this was recklessness or genius. Elvis gave a small nod to the conductor. The orchestra responded instantly, strings rising in a slow, solemn swell. The familiar, haunting introduction of "You'll Never Walk Alone" filled the air. The effect was immediate. The jeers fell silent. The first notes seemed to draw every breath inward. as though the room itself leaned in to listen. Elvis closed his eyes, gripping the microphone with both hands, and began to sing. "When you walk through a storm, hold your head up high." The lyrics rang with raw sincerity. His voice carried not just melody, but conviction, as though he believed every word was being written in real time for the man in that second row. Each phrase rose higher, not in performance, but in prayer. The audience, caught between outrage and awe, found themselves swept into the current. The same people who had been ready to tear the man apart now stood immobilized, their anger slowly unraveling in the face of something they could not resist. Midway through the song, the tension cracked in the most unexpected way. Eyes turned toward the man who had thrown the bottle. He was no longer rigid. His head had bowed, his hands pressed to his knees. In the dim light, his shoulders trembled. And then, shockingly, tears glistened on his cheeks. A collective shiver ran through the crowd. It was impossible to ignore. The very man they had despised was crying, broken open by a song. Murmurs spread, but no one dared shout. The power of the moment belonged entirely to Elvis's voice, steady and unrelenting. "Walk on through the wind, walk on through the rain, though your dreams be tossed and blown." The music swelled higher, the orchestra filling every corner of the vast showroom. For a moment, the casino world outside, the dice, the cards, the neon, felt galaxies away. The people inside the International weren't gamblers or critics or hysterical fans anymore. They were witnesses to something almost unearthly. One man's pain being met with another man's compassion, transformed through music. By the time Elvis reached the final line, the hall was so quiet, one could hear the creak of chairs as people leaned forward, breathless. "And you'll never walk alone." The last note hung in the air, resonant, trembling, until the orchestra let it dissolve into silence. Elvis lowered the microphone slowly, his eyes still closed, his chest heaving. Then the eruption came. The crowd exploded in applause, standing as one, cheering, clapping, sobbing. People hugged strangers beside them. Women buried their faces in scarves. Even the reporters dropped their pens, momentarily abandoning cynicism as the sound of thousands rose like a single voice. And there, in the center of it all, the man in the second row remained motionless, except for the tears that would not stop falling. The irony was stark. A hall full of people had been united, not by punishing him, but by watching him undone. And it had been Elvis who orchestrated it, not through anger, not through force, but through a song that had become something more than entertainment. For the first time that night, the audience understood. This was not just a performance. It was a reckoning. And they were part of it. The ovation would not end. Applause surged like thunder rolling across the desert, echoing off every wall of the International showroom. Some people clapped until their hands ached. Others simply stood frozen, tears coursing freely. The orchestra lowered their instruments, exchanging glances of disbelief. Even seasoned musicians who had played hundreds of nights with Elvis knew they had just witnessed something entirely different. Elvis stood motionless in the center of the stage, his head bowed slightly, letting the roar wash over him. For once, he did not smile or joke. He seemed to be listening, not just to the crowd, but to the undercurrent beneath it, the stunned realization of what they had all shared. And then something shifted. In the front rows, eyes turned toward the man who had thrown the bottle. He had not risen with the others to applaud. He sat hunched forward, his face streaked with tears, his hands trembling on the table before him. His shame was written in every movement. But then Slowly, he pushed back his chair. The legs scraped against the polished floor with a sound that cut through the ovation like a blade. The applause faltered. Heads turned. Conversations hushed. In an instant, the room's energy swung back to him. He stood unsteadily, as if his legs might give way. His friends shrank farther into the shadows, refusing to meet his eyes, but he didn't look at them. He looked only at the stage, at Elvis. The crowd tensed. Whispers hissed through the air. What's he doing? Is he going to try again? Hands gripped purses. Guards shifted closer, ready to pounce. Even from the balcony, people leaned forward, their stomachs knotted with dread. The man took a step forward, then another. Every motion felt exaggerated in the silence that had fallen again. His shoes clicked against the floor, echoing unnaturally loud. He reached the edge of the aisle and began to move down it, one step at a time, toward the stage. The tension was unbearable. Some shouted warnings. "Stop him! Get him out of here!" Security surged forward, but Elvis lifted his hand sharply from the stage. The command was clear. Wait. The man kept walking. Closer, closer, until he reached the foot of the stage. The crowd braced, expecting another act of aggression. Some people closed their eyes, unwilling to watch. Then, without warning, he dropped to his knees. Gasps ripped through the room. A woman screamed. A man muttered, "Dear God!" Nobody had expected this. The very person who minutes before had hurled glass in violence now knelt like a penitent before the singer he had targeted. The man lowered his head, his shoulders shaking uncontrollably. His hands, clasped together, pressed against his chest. He did not speak, but his posture said everything. It was surrender. It was apology without words. The audience was struck dumb. The transformation was so stark, so dramatic. It seemed almost unreal. Some fans clutched at each other, crying harder. Others looked away, embarrassed by the rawness of it. Even the most cynical critics sat frozen, their notebooks open but forgotten in their laps. On stage, Elvis did not move for several seconds. He watched in silence, his expression unreadable. He had seen crowds scream, faint, fight. He had seen adoration taken to extremes. But this was different. This was not worship. It was something deeper, heavier. Finally, Elvis stepped forward, just close enough that the stage lights cast both him and the kneeling man in the same glow. He did not speak. He did not gesture. He simply stood, towering above the figure on the ground, the embodiment of authority tempered with grace. The crowd's silence was absolute. Not a glass clinked, not a cough broke the spell. Every soul in the room was locked in that tableau. The star standing tall, the aggressor bowed in remorse. It was then the audience began to realize they had witnessed a complete reversal. The man who had come to disrupt, to humiliate, was himself broken open before thousands. And Elvis, by refusing vengeance, had brought it about not with fists, but with music. The power of it was overwhelming. People felt the moment etch itself into memory, an image that would outlast the neon, the hotel, even the city itself. And yet, no one knew what Elvis would do next. Would he reach down and offer his hand? Would he order the man to stand? Or would he let him kneel there, a living reminder of what anger turned into when met with mercy? The audience held its breath again, waiting, knowing the next gesture would decide not just the man's fate, but the legacy of the night itself. For what felt like an eternity, the man remained kneeling at the base of the stage. His shoulders shook, his head bowed, the posture of someone broken down to the bone. The crowd didn't move. 1,000 people held their breath, waiting for the next act in this unplanned drama. Security hovered at the edges of the scene, tense and restless, ready to drag him away if given the signal. But the signal never came. Elvis raised his hand slightly, just enough to halt the guards who had stepped forward. The gesture was calm, steady, and absolute. They froze mid-stride, retreating like soldiers who had been commanded to stand down. The audience watched with disbelief. He was still protecting the very man who had tried to harm him. The silence deepened. It wasn't the silence of anticipation anymore, but of awe, of not daring to intrude on what was unfolding. Somewhere high in the balcony, a woman sobbed uncontrollably. In the rear of the room, a man muttered a prayer under his breath. No one had expected to walk into a Vegas showroom and witness a moment that felt like scripture being written before their eyes. Elvis stepped forward. Slowly, deliberately, he bent at the waist, lowering himself toward the man below. The lights caught the rhinestones of his suit, scattering white fire across the room. The image burned itself into the memory of everyone present. The king of rock and roll leaning down from the stage, arm extended, not in anger, not in spectacle, but in an offer of grace. His hand hovered for a second, then stretched toward the kneeling figure. The man looked up. His face was streaked with tears, eyes bloodshot, his expression raw with humiliation and regret. He hesitated, as if afraid to touch the very hand he had nearly wounded. The pause felt endless. Then, with a trembling motion, he reached out and clasped Elvis's hand. The effect on the crowd was volcanic. The room erupted into cheers, screams, applause. The noise was deafening, shaking the walls, rattling glasses on tables. People jumped to their feet, some crying, some laughing, many both at once. Strangers embraced each other, overcome with release. And yet, Elvis didn't milk the moment. He didn't pose for the cameras, didn't hold the man's hand aloft like a trophy. He simply helped him to his feet, steadying him for a second, then gave a single nod, quiet, almost fatherly. He leaned into the microphone and spoke only 4 words. "We all fight battles." The hall quieted instantly, straining to hear. Elvis let the words hang, then continued, softer, more intimate, as if speaking to each person individually. "Tonight, let's just love." It was not rehearsed. It was not scripted. It was so simple, almost fragile. But its very simplicity carried a power that none of the elaborate lights, costumes, or orchestrations could match. Those words reached into hearts more directly than any lyric could. The crowd erupted again, but this time the energy was different. It wasn't hysteria. It wasn't the fevered worship of fans clawing for scarves. It was gratitude, reverence, something closer to devotion born of recognition. They weren't just watching a star. They were watching a man who had chosen to rise above vengeance, who had answered violence with mercy. Even the press corps, hardened skeptics who had come searching for flaws, sat dumbstruck. Some scribbled blindly, their hands shaking. Others simply stared, unable to capture it on paper. Cameras flashed, but even the photos would never fully explain the electricity in that room. The man stood now, head lowered, unable to meet the eyes of those around him. But the crowd no longer shouted for his removal. Some even clapped for him, moved not by what he had done, but by what had just been done for him. He had become part of the story. Not the villain, not the victim, but the symbol of how hatred could be undone. Elvis released his hand and stepped back toward the center of the stage. He didn't bask in triumph. His movements were unhurried, almost weary, as though the weight of the moment pressed on him too. He adjusted the microphone stand, took a breath, and gave the band a small nod. The musicians waited, holding their instruments like weapons sheathed in reverence. They knew, without being told, that the next song would have to carry the night to its conclusion. But Elvis didn't rush. He allowed the cheers to crest, allowed the emotions in the room to settle into something deeper. At last, he looked out across the sea of faces, thousands of eyes locked on him, wide with awe, wet with tears. He gave a faint smile, humble, almost shy. The contrast was staggering. The most famous man in the room, dressed in glittering splendor, standing before them with the quietness of someone who had just given away a piece of his soul. No announcement was needed. Everyone knew the night had crossed a threshold. This wasn't just a concert anymore. It was a moment of transformation. And as the audience continued to cheer, Elvis stood at the center of the storm, calm and steady, the embodiment of mercy in rhinestones. The hall still vibrated with cheers, yet underneath the noise lay a sense of reverence, as though the audience understood they had been carried somewhere beyond entertainment. Elvis remained at the microphone, breathing deeply, his chest rising and falling beneath the rhinestones that glittered like stars caught in fabric. He looked out at the faces before him, some streaked with tears, some glowing with relief, and for a moment his expression softened into something almost private. He didn't need to announce the next song. Everyone in the room knew what was coming. For years, he had closed with the same number, the ballad that had become both his benediction and his farewell. Yet, tonight, it carried a weight it had never held before. The orchestra swelled, gentle strings rising like a tide. Elvis leaned into the microphone, his voice low and steady. "Wise men say, only fools rush in." The crowd hushed at once. The transformation was extraordinary. Moments earlier they had screamed, clapped, roared. But now they listened in silence, each syllable absorbed like a blessing. The familiar melody filled the showroom, not as routine, but as ritual. Elvis's voice carried a new timbre. It wasn't just performance. It was weary, tender, almost prayerful. Each phrase felt like a confession, a reaching out. His eyes moved across the hall, but they lingered, for a heartbeat, on the man in the second row. The same man who had thrown the bottle. The man stood now, no longer defiant, his lips moving faintly. He was singing along. Those nearest him noticed and were startled, but instead of recoiling, some placed their hands on his shoulders. No one hissed at him now. No one demanded his removal. The unity of the moment had swallowed anger whole. He, too, had been folded into the song. But I can't help falling in love with you. By the second verse, voices began to rise from the audience. At first, soft, tentative, then stronger, fuller. Entire rows joined in, then balconies, then the farthest corners of the room. What had started as a single voice became a chorus of thousands. The sound was overwhelming. It wasn't polished, it wasn't rehearsed, but it carried a raw beauty that no orchestra could replicate. Strangers sang beside each other in harmony, and for the first time all night, there were no divisions. Not between fans and critics, not between wealthy tourists and working locals, not even between the man who had tried to break the show and those who had nearly driven him out. All were bound by the same words, the same melody. Elvis smiled faintly, almost shyly, and stepped back from the microphone for a moment. He let them sing, listening as the crowd carried the song on their own. His eyes shone with something close to tears, though he blinked them back quickly. Then he returned to the mic, layering his voice over theirs, blending with the multitude as though he were not above them, but among them. Like a river flows, surely, to the sea. The sound rose higher, stronger. The walls seemed to tremble, chandeliers swaying gently with the force of it. The musicians, moved beyond professionalism, softened their playing, letting the audience itself become the centerpiece. And then the final chorus came. Elvis stretched the words, his tone filled with warmth and surrender. The audience joined him, every throat open, every hand clapping, some people swaying arm in arm. It was not just the close of a concert, it was communion. For I can't help falling in love with you. The last note lingered, sustained by hundreds of voices, then dissolved into silence so pure it felt sacred. For several seconds, no one moved. Then the hall erupted again, the loudest ovation of the night, shaking the very foundation of the International. Elvis bowed deeply, cape spreading around him like wings, his head lowered in humility. When he straightened, he did not speak, only placed his hand over his heart and nodded to the crowd. The gesture was small, but it said everything. The man in the second row remained standing, his face wet, his body trembling. This time, when people looked at him, there was no hatred. There was recognition. He had been transformed, and, in some mysterious way, so had they all. Long after the final chord, the audience refused to leave. They lingered, buzzing, embracing, some unable to stop crying. Outside, the Strip carried on with its usual neon frenzy, gamblers and tourists oblivious to the miracle that had unfolded within those walls. The next morning, newspapers wrote of the bottle incident, focusing on the danger, the drama. But those who had been there told a different story. They didn't speak of glass or security or scandal. They spoke of how Elvis had taken a moment of hatred and turned it into unity, how his voice had stitched a broken night back together. For them, it was not a performance, but a legend. A night when a man in rhinestones reminded thousands that music could conquer anger, that forgiveness could silence fury, that even in the most unlikely of places, Las Vegas, under the blinding lights of a casino showroom, something holy could emerge. And as they remembered it, they would always return to the same image. Elvis, weary but radiant, singing a love song that became larger than himself, while the man who had once tried to break him stood among the crowd, singing too.